Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James or Jexic, and today we're excited to bring on Exile and Cherez to discuss gates. By popular demand, actually, they wanted to have an episode about discussing gate placement. We know they were in the top two of the last big Plaid Hat tournament, so maybe we discuss a little bit about that tournament and their experience with that. It's kind of funny, I think, going into it because Exile's a newer player, but was probably not the underdog, surprisingly, so it's based on the record going into it. But he was also playing the underdog faction of the Shimmer Sea Fae.
And the underdog faction of the Filth, That was a...
Equal underdogs. I will say Storm Goblins, though, is also an underdog faction. And a release pair, if I remember correctly, between Shimmer Sea Fae and Storm Goblins.
You think they're an underdog? Interesting.
Listen, with the factions that I normally play, most of them absolutely hate Storm Goblins. So, not to me, but I think in the all around, I'll put it this way, the community power rankings, I think they're generally on the lower end of them, although I disagree with that statement personally.
I don't know if they're on the low end of the power scale so much as they're just not picked that often. It's kind of a surprise when you run into them in the open queue. It's like, oh, these guys, what do they do again? They are one of the most unique designs for sure.
I feel like this was one of the first tournaments which had such broad faction diversity, especially in the last two rounds. Usually the last two rounds are just filled with Shadow Elves and Filth and High Elves, or, because of maybe how many strong factions there are currently, there was just a very broad range of factions in the last two pools.
I thought it was cool. We saw that a bit, I think it was last time as well, when Davude won it. Davude brought a fair amount of factions we hadn't really seen go all the way. Fallen Kingdom was one of them.
And Mountain Vargath was one, too.
And Vargath.
And maybe Birds?
I think it was maybe Birds, yeah. Yeah, just not a common, not bad factions by any means, but none of the meta factions.
I think that it's kind of indicative of faction strength isn't as much of a factor as player skill, I think is a big takeaway for me for the tournament, because you had Shimmer Sea Fae going all the way, but also just a lot of people bringing more esoteric factions and doing really well. Cherez with Storm Goblins. I know Solitaire had a crazy lineup. Chosen Grove, Fungal Dwarves, and a couple other spicy picks, and he barely didn't make it into the finals. I think he went 7-1 in the final pool, and only because I had a crazy Mountain Vargath hand against the tree did he lose a single game in the final round of pools. And I'm sure there's many other people who took spicy picks and did quite well. So I think that that's kind of the takeaway that I've got there.
I'm looking back. Davude did play Birds as one of his top three. His fourth deck was actually Shadow Elves, but he didn't play them in the finals because they were his fourth deck, I guess. In the tournament before we were talking about here. On the flip side, I've never gotten into a final pool in base deck tournaments, and I usually just pick what I like. Oh, this time I got the closest I've gotten to getting in the final pool, and I kind of just picked chalk all the way, so... I don't know.
Yeah. And the two people who stopped you from getting to the final pool are on this podcast currently.
Yeah, we were in the same pool for pool 2, and I beat Cherez, lost to Exile, and then I lost to Prophet. That was the big game that I almost won.
Yeah, it was really close. You got third or fourth, right, in that pool?
I think I ended up fourth because I lost to Prophet. And had I beaten Prophet, I think I would have been second and moved on to the last two pools.
That was a crazy game also. Drakesun versus Sand Goblins.
Yeah. Some people were telling me that Drakesun might be Sand Goblin's worst matchup. So maybe that's why I had a decent shot at it. But I played a long game and almost beat Sand Goblins against Prophet. So
yeah,
definitely think that it helps to pick strong factions, because I think we do see a lot of people placing high. But then again, the two people that were in the final didn't necessarily pick the strongest factions or the community consensus strongest factions or whatever.
Did you both, when you were picking your factions, think about which 3 you would get if you made it to the final pool, or did you just put them in an order that you felt like was pretty good?
There's actually a fun story behind that, because when I picked initially, I think I picked my factions right when I started playing Shimmer Sea Fae. I had not, by the time the tournament started, I had not played them much at all. And I put them fourth because I was like, well, if I get to the finals, I don't want to play Shimmer Sea Fae. And then I played them more, and then I got to the finals, and I went, well, shit, I really want to play Shimmer Sea Fae in the finals, because that'd be really fun. And I messaged Joe, and I was like, hey, and Cherez first, make sure I had his consent. I was like, hey, could we swap around my picks and maybe drop? I think my third pick was Forged, and I
Yeah.
dropped that one, put Shimmer Sea Fae in instead, and he said sure. So that's how Shimmer Sea Fae actually got played in the finals.
Ooh, I
But
didn't know this.
then I think both Cherez and at least one of the B tournament people didn't get the faction picks that they wanted. Because I believe, Cherez, you had picked Cloaks, or you thought you had picked Cloaks in your top 3 and Isle Vekit as your 4th, but you played Isle Vekit instead, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was like I told Exile, it was kind of cool to like. I think I'm definitely more comfortable with Cloaks than Isle Vekit just because Isle Vekit are newer and I have less games played with them. But at the same time, it is cool to be the first player to have Isle Vekit in the finals. I can have that over Nestle for the rest of Nestle's career.
So there was a little bit of pick shenanigans and swapping around, although honestly it all ended up working out for the best.
Storm Goblins beat the Shimmer Sea Fae as you would expect if they were Pokemon, right?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
It was super effective.
Lightning against water.
Against the water.
It was super effective. Man, they fry the fish. It's a rough matchup.
And I think I saw many dice rolls in there where you could have said from the Shimmer Sea Face side that it was not very effective.
Oh yeah, no, that was one of my, I think, historically bad games. And there was like one where I was like, oh, I just need to hit this 5 out of 4 melee, 3 range at the end. I'm like, maybe I have a shot. Ezek took like 16 dice and was still at 1 HP. And I was like, well, maybe I can do this cheeky little play. And I was like, nope, just throughout the whole game, the dice said, nah, this isn't your one. I'm like, you know what? That's okay. I'll take the dice out in the other 2 matches. This is already a hard matchup.
Yeah, that was a fun series. Like you said, it's probably Storm Goblin favored in general. I probably had the more favorable matches overall, I think, in terms of, I think Storm Goblins is definitely favored over Fae. And then I think Isle Vekit probably is 50-50 to slightly favored over
The Filth?
the Filth, yeah.
I don't know if I'd agree with that. I don't think it's like super far off, but I don't know if I'd say Isle Vekit is favored.
I think with the draw order Cherez had, it wasn't favored because the 2 things that I think Isle Vekit got on Filth, that one, they're really good at single lane damage, so they can focus fire down mutants, like a Dancer, Roko, Sniper line, or, take 2 to 3 attacks really consistently on a single mutant that way. And then also Waveborn Relic is huge because if something's on the edge of Demba's aura, one attack can knock it out of the way, and then the second attack or 3 attacks can then kill a mutant to deny boosts. But Cherez didn't draw a Waveborn Relic for like 20 cards, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a thing where not having that tool was a bit rough. It's close overall, but I would play the edges to Isle Vekit just because they have the tool.
I could be wrong.
As with every matchup in the game, it's underexplored, I would say. Lots of fun, like matchup specific things that I think you can get into and dive deep into.
Our last matchup, MV versus Sand Goblins, I think it's still 50-50. It might be slightly Sand Goblins favored just because Sand Goblins have tools which last longer, but it is a scary matchup, I will say. From the Sand Goblin side, it is still very scary, especially with Torridon.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree that it's like a slight edge to SG, but Ramming Advance, my beloved, can single-handedly be what you can play around in that matchup, at least in my opinion.
It's really hard to play around it, though. That game, I was just terrified of ramming advanced Torridon, and it worked out in the end, but there was, I think, 1 or 2 turns where if you had Torridon, I could have easily just lost on the spot.
Yeah, I think drew Torridon, like, bottom, like, my, 8th card from the bottom, and I drew both my Ramming Advances around the same time. One of my favorite board states to look at from that game was there was a turn. I didn't have Torridon, I think, at this point, but there was a turn where Krusk was just in the center of your side of the board with a unit or structure on all 4 sides because you're just terrified of ramming advanced Torridon, yeeting and hitting Krusk in the face.
Yeah, Krusk being a structure is so detrimental for it's so scary. So scary.
Yeah, you can climb over him. But yeah, no, it's like I would say it's relatively a pretty even like set in terms of matchup. Probably just like a slight edge in at least the 2 non-Shimmer Sea Fae Storm Goblins ones. But overall, it was a very fun time.
I mean, having done these tournaments now, is there anything you would change about the format if you could, or do you kind of think it's a pretty solid format?
I think a lot of people wanted to start on the weekends. Mondays are kind of rough, especially when it lasts multiple weeks, and it's hard to plan around. I don't think there's another way to plan it in terms of I think you do need to do 3 days unless you somehow have the community organize it. And I do think it will get, if especially the later rounds, it will get to the point where, after 6 weeks or 5 weeks of doing it, it does get painful just because it's hard to, motivation's not the issue, but just as locked in, I guess, for that many weeks, especially with everything happening in real life. And also you don't want to set 6 weeks aside, especially when, there's how hard it is to get the final pool these days, it's a good chance you don't even make it. And also you rather spend time doing other things at that point. For me, the only way which I would change is potentially the start date. But I know that means that Joe has to go in on the weekend, which is probably not what he wants to do to start the games.
Surely there's a way to automate this process fully.
He's talked about wanting to automate it, but he's always proved a little more difficult than he expects it to be. And then he's like, all right, I'll just start another one. And he said he wants to start a deck building one soon. And I haven't seen anything more about it, but I heard Exile said that that's what was happening next.
Yeah, I believe they mentioned it when they were streaming the finals that the next one would probably be deck building. But it didn't, give any time frame on it. I guess just to piggyback off of what Cherez said, starting it on the weekends would be quite nice because I know a lot of people who had gripes about the Monday start time. I guess about the 3-day versus 45. One thing that we actually did, which was a really nice and fun way to end it, was we played, I think, the majority of the Mountain Varghulf versus Sand Goblins game and the back half of the Isle Vekid versus Filth game live. We just sat on a call for 3 or 4 hours on a Sunday. And we just busted it out. It was quite fun to do. So that's always an option, I suppose. Both players have to have buy-in to do that, but just because it's 3-day timers doesn't mean you can't play it live if your opponent is willing.
How much trash talk was on that call?
A lot of each of us sitting in silence for 10 minutes on a turn and then taking a turn.
Yeah, going for walks in the middle of it. It was a fun time. A little bit of trash talk. Mostly just consoling each other on our dice, or being gleefully happy that the person with their dice are.
yeah, it was fun. It was fun. The only other thing I would probably do for changing the the tournament would be if there's some way to shorten it. That would be ideal, and maybe just make the the overall structure just a little bit more forgiving. Trying to think of some community run tournaments I played in the past for Magic the Gathering and other card games. Round robin kind of style, cut to a quote unquote day 2, essentially round 2. Do a cut to a bracket tournament, that kind of thing. Can make, I would say, the final pool situation a lot more palatable. Just because, man, it is tough. Solitaire went 7-1 in the final pool and didn't quite make it. And the same could be said for a bracket, right? If you do a bracket style thing, but then at least it's a little bit more concrete, right? Where you're okay, I lost here because I lost this match, not I because of how the tiebreakers work out. That that kind of thing. I guess a more not traditional, but emulating some of what I've seen from some other TCGs and formats like that, where they have a quote unquote day 1 cut to a day 2 bracket style thing, and maybe that can shorten it. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do some type of. I'd have to look at other games do it, but maybe smaller group, less games per week, and just maybe over a longer period of time. You only have 2 games. I'm not sure if people want to spend longer than it already is, but maybe if you have less games, it's easier to deal with.
The way Magic would do it is you have 8 rounds of Swiss or 9 rounds of Swiss or whatever, and then a cut to the top 32 or something like that, and then do a bracket from there, or top 16 and do a bracket from there. When then you'd only have 1 game a week, or maybe you could do your top 3, do a best of 3 against all the people on the way. That could be kind of neat.
That would be cool. That would be cool. Doing it essentially how the
finals are, but do that with a bracket.
It doesn't necessarily be cut to top 32, because if you did 1 game a week, or 1 opponent a week, which it could be multiple games, you would have 32, 16, 8, 4, and then final
5 weeks.
5 weeks. But if you just did a cut to top 8 or top 16, depending on your overall tournament count, that would be 3 to 4 weeks, essentially the second half of the tournament, right? So if you did a 2-month tournament, 4 weeks of Swiss or pools or what have you, and then a cut to top 16 or something like that, 2 months, as opposed to what was this one, 2.5? I want to say something like that.
8 weeks, yeah.
I always like a a Swiss format because then the people who are winning the most are going to play each other.
Yeah. Now we just need Joe to, upend the whole tournament structure.
I have a question for everyone here, I guess, because me and Exile were talking about this. So I'm curious about your thoughts of Aaron and Jexic, because also you guys have played longer than me. Do you think there's been a shift in style in terms of at least top level play to being more aggressive compared to how it was like even a year ago or like a couple of Plaid Hat tournaments ago?
More aggressive.
Well, I think there's it's tough when you talk about top level play because I think there's a couple different places where people play,
Mm-hmm.
Aaron is very familiar with what it is in Division 1 of the league, or in Division 2 as well. And I think that's a little different than what you even see in the tournaments or Open Q. But I think if we look at some of the people that have really succeeded in Open Q, I think it's probably true that there's more aggressive play and more, like if you think of someone like Dead Sands or something like that. I mean, I've been playing very poorly in general lately. My ELO has gone down to 1100 something, and I'm hardly focusing right, so I don't know. I've fallen in the live league as well, and I'm definitely one of the more aggressive players, so I don't know. I haven't been having more success, so I don't know.
James bringing up the format's a good point. I think it might depend a lot on the format. I don't think in the Plaid Hat tournament it's probably been that much more aggressive. I feel like that's the sort of the middle ground, and it's a faction dependent too. Because if you're playing more aggressive factions, people are less likely to sit back with factions like Forged or the Drake Sun or the Shimmersea Fae. So I think part of it is there's been some aggressive factions that have come out recently. Even Guild Dwarves, they can play very defensive, but they can also get way up in your grill and be pretty nasty to deal with at times. Yeah, I don't know if the overall play has really dictated that. There's been definitely some pushes, like James was saying, in the ranked play of some very aggressive players, but in the SW Zone League, I don't think it's been overly aggressive. And all the players who are known for playing more econ will definitely play aggressive when it's benefits for them. I've had a couple of games in my last season that I played pretty aggressive, got wins out of them. I feel like a lot of the top players in the SW Zone League will just bide their time and wait for that time to pounce if they're playing aggressive. That's more their style of aggressive versus right off the bat pushing in. And I think part of that is just risk mitigating, because if you're biding your time, then you hope at that point when you are ready for it that you have the cards to really support your aggressive play, versus if you do a push off the bat, you just might not draw the right cards to support your aggressive play. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of factors that probably play in, but I would probably say overall not much change.
We're not seeing, like you said, shadow elves versus cloaks every game. So it does it does lead to different play styles than when there's a lot less of a limited pool versus like we talked about earlier. A lot more decks being played in general, which leads to a lot more differences in tempo. Let's say it that way, being used.
You take one of the league matchups right now. You got Obsidian Dwarves versus Tundra Orcs, and that's aggression out the gate, I mean, that's aggression on both sides. You don't have to play it fully aggressive, but those are two very aggressive factions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have the historical perspective because I only started in October of last year. It would make a lot of sense if it's both matchup dependent, but also it's a relatively small community, right? Look at Div 1 of Zone League. There's 10, 8 regulars, quote unquote, there, I would say, with some guest stars, but a lot of the same faces. And people tend to have playstyles that they usually fall into, right? So if those players are just a bit less aggressive, that's what the metagame there looks like. I think that it's probably just dependent on both of those things. Just Dead Sands, you can give him anything and he will run at you and probably make it work.
Just give him a stick, nothing else, just a stick.
Yeah, and then there's other players where you give them anything and they'll be like, okay, I will not discard a single card and I will stay right here.
You don't have to call me out like that, Exile.
I wasn't thinking of you, but yeah. I guess that would probably be just whoever's playing and what matchups and decks people are playing probably just influences a lot.
And sometimes you'll find a player who surprises you with some aggression. I know I brought this game up in the past, but OL doesn't play like crazy aggressive, probably like middle of the road. And I got my face slammed in by an aggressive polar dwarves one time that OL was
Still
playing.
leaves a
so
mark.
Still leaves a mark. I will never forget that game.
Did you guys watch one of the funniest games which I've seen in a while was Astros lost to a Polar Doors player who just like had both ramming advances, just was in the face. It's like one of those once in a lifetime Polar Dwarf games. Sometimes it just leaves a mark.
Are these against their Felth?
Cloaks, I think.
Oh, Cloaks. They had no room to move after like 3 turns and just forfeit essentially because
Yeah, it was like turn 3, and I think Blocks was like pinned in like 2 squares in his back row by just a mound of PD stuff.
That is how I felt as Cooldak against the Polar Dwarves of OL that one time.
It is funny how like those games stick with you. You know what I mean?
Polar Dwarfs top jets. I'm all in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say Polar Dwarves are good till I die, but nobody believes me, so.
I re-listened to our tier list thing, and we had them in A tier, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I stand by it.
I just don't see him played enough, honestly, to really know. I put him in my personal like B-ish tier.
I will reiterate my win rate with them just for the viewers' sake. I have an 84% win rate with them.
Is that 7 games?
No, it's like 30 out of the last 1,000.
Okay, that's not bad.
Yeah, there used to be, I think, like Donkey like had never lost with them or something like
Yeah,
that.
Donkey when before the changes, Donkey had like a 95% win rate with them. It was insane.
Back when in the old days, long before my time, when you had double ice rams that could hit summoners, and the metagame was what? Just master set and starter set factions?
Pretty
For a
close.
while, yeah.
I could see in that metagame just PD cleaning house.
They were pretty good. If you ever want to see them just destroy my Savannah elves, there's a YouTube video somewhere.
And speaking of Polar Dwarves, they're one of the first factions to move structures around, and one of the most important structures are gates.
Hey, we got there.
Way to bring us
Let's
back
give
in.
it. We got there.
Nice.
That was the topic of this episode tonight. What are some tips on how to effectively use gates better overall? I guess before we even do that, we should talk about how we're going to discuss like where gates are. And if you picture it kind of like a chessboard almost, like A1 would be the lowest left corner, and like F1 would be on the right, and then like 8 would be way on your opponent's corner. And like a typical starting spot for most gates is like D2 or D3. That's how we're going to talk about gates. So like for example, with the Wayfarers, I often like to put like an A3 or an F3 gate, which is like kind of on the wings.
That's all we had to talk about gates, and
Yeah,
we'll
just,
wrap it up there.
I'll open with just like with the one tip that I often gave people. I know Art of Breeze was big on this for a while too. In order to get more summoning spots to cover more of an area, we often talk about a gate a knight's move away from your starting gate, right? So like if you have a gate at D3 to start, like a lot of factions do, you might place your next one on F4 or perhaps B4.
B2 gate, my beloved.
Or like you're saying, back gate, like a B2 gate would be further back, but also a knight's move away. When you have a knight's move away, familiar with chess at all, it basically means like a little L away, and you have a lot more summoning spots open. And if you have a unit like the Drake's Rebellion or the Cave Goblins where you need 2 gates near each other to be able to use Cling or Mount, that'll work.
That's I would say like a really good introductory. If you're not thinking about it too much, just kind of placing a knight's move away will generally give you good summoning spots.
Adding on to Jexic, so gates in general, and you guys can of course add on if I forget anything, usually have like 3 different uses, right? The first, most obvious thing is that you're going to summon things out of them. And of course, Jexic was pointing out, a lot of times you do not want to condense things. An obvious example is against Storm Goblins, but against a lot of different factions, you want to have more spaces just so that your opponent can't clog your gates. The second use for them is protecting your summoner, even if you're not summoning anything from them. A lot of abilities are able to go through units, impact or push units, but they don't push gates. Or, for example, in the case of Sky Assault, are able to shoot through gates. And then the third, and this is always a hotly contested subject, is for magic. When do you discard a gate versus play it? And I guess we can go into that later on.
Yeah, I would say that those would probably be the biggest uses. This kind of goes into protecting your summoner, but just occupying a space. I tend to think of gates personally as usually long-term investments, although they can be a tactic that sets up, especially if your summoner's in the mix and you can place a gate off of them, or your opponent is like coming into your back 3 rows. The ability to drop a structure in your back 3 rows is something that every faction has access to, and sometimes just putting something in a space can get your opponent when they weren't expecting it. I can think of a game, I think in Faction Masters, if I'm not mistaken, of Mountain Vargrith versus Deepwood Groaks against Snaug. I made a small misplay that almost cost me the game, where I had positioned something like one space farther back than it should have been, and because of that, it was like their row 3 versus their row 4, or from your perspective, row 5 versus row 6, so like one space back. And because of that, they put a gate in that spot, and it cut off a place that I really wanted to have a unit. And thankfully, I think like the dice and the cards ended up working out. But sometimes just being able to occupy a square with something that's also got, decent chunk of health, 5, and is not a unit, so a lot of things that could do damage to it might not be able to. That's also something that can come up, be open to, I suppose.
Yeah, some of those direct damage factions just can't do some of their damage to gates like the Phoenix Elves.
You guys were pointing out, it's also important you don't want to have all your units clumped in a corner. Good spacing on your gates can sometimes be important. That said, sometimes you do want to be clumped in a corner. You're trying to corner camp and you want your opponent to come to you and not have any targets to hit. I think gate placement is something which is definitely, different factions have certain gate spots they love, but in general, it's very fluid based off board state. I guess we can go into specific gate placements, which are interesting.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would want to like talk about on just how to use gates effectively better overall is, how do I put this exactly? I think in order to place good gates, you kind of have to start with examining the matchup a bit. And this can be also like you said, certain factions like certain spots because they're just generally useful for that faction against regardless of their opponent. But sometimes even your opponent can influence your gate placement. But I think that like taking a second and going, okay, I'm Mountain Vargrith versus Sand Goblins, to use a game that we talked about earlier. What is my objective? Well, if you're me, then your objective is to set up ramming advanced lines, and you also don't want gates too far forward that SG can like chip easily and then like kill the biter with a turret or tuck a wrench rat on a gate. So generally, that means that I would place row 2 gates on the flanks if I was Mountain Vargrith against Sand Goblins. And then you could flip it and look from the Sand Goblin's perspective and ask yourself, oh, well, what do I want? Well, having like one gate on the field so you can detonate your 10, still have a gate available. Also setting up like a biter carry position that you can like load wrenches onto a biter. Those are good things. So setting up your gates that way so you have that access available. But I guess just to bring it back to the main point, I think that the best way to place good gates is to understand the matchup first. What you're trying to get out of the position, what your opponent is, and trying to get what you want and deny them what they want.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And it's kind of weird because some factions like very weird gate placements. Like, for example, the Drake Sun and like Skyspear Avians factions with Fly don't mind like gates right next to each other or gates like very clumped together, like taking up similar summoning spots. But almost all the other factions, that's a terrible idea. But because you have that ability to fly and like maneuver around it very easily, you could still make great use of those, and sometimes that even protects like a summoning spot that your opponent can't get to, and so there's some interesting aspects there with factions like that.
I had a game recently, I think it was also against Snaug, if I'm not mistaken. It was against the Drake's Rebellion. It might have been Snaug, might have been somebody else, but I was playing Eternal Council, and they had such a good gate spot that I just did not expect. And I didn't play a gate, even though I had one. If they played a gate on the left side or the right side, I was just going to migrate to the other side of the field. That was my plan. So I started pushing and I kind of kept my options open. I was like, all right, if they don't have a gate, great. And if they have one, I'll just go the other way. And they put a gate behind their 10 gate. And it was such a good move that I was just so impressed with this single gate placement because it meant that they could set up Wormling plus a Dragoon or some other unit, right, on either side of the field, on my row 2 or my row 4. So it kind of just meant that, like, oh yeah, this I never thought about, like, outside of like gate destruction scenarios, right? Where you have a weak gate, you put a gate behind it, so if they kill the gate in front, it opens up a summoning spot. Outside of like that kind of thing, never thought about vertically stacked gates, at least just like early game, like first thing. And that's what they did, and it ended up working out pretty well for them. I think I ultimately ended up winning that game by melting Brimstorm with Psychic Salt, but it was a really, really cool gate placement to see. And experimenting, I think, is a good thing to do as well. Like, don't just try the same thing every time. Don't just do it randomly. Try out some different gate positions. There's a lot of squares on your side of the board that you can place them, and you might find something cool.
Do you remember Cherez likes to place a vertical gate next to each other and with the storm goblins too sometimes, you were saying?
Yeah, so when I said that, it definitely is very viable as Storm Goblins, because in Storm Goblins you want to have circuit and you want to have units touching each other, especially because, or summoning spots next to each other, just because you want to be able to easily, without moving a Vault Swapper, get it within the circuit. And so usually the gates on top of each other, I think as a Storm Goblins player, I'm usually doing that as more of a defensive tactic. For example, if I'm really afraid of my opponent getting on my side. But the positive thing is that even if afterwards, when Thrak is safe again and doesn't need the gate there, gates on top of each other, because the summoning spots are touching, are still really good for the Storm Goblins. Or not the worst, let's say it that way. To expand on what you guys are saying, I think in general, so just like given just an average non-specialized Summoner Wars deck, I think the first question you usually ask, especially with your first gate, which is usually the most important gate, is do I have the range advantage against my opponent, or do they have the range advantage against me? I think is the first question I ask myself. And then the second thing is this faction which my opponent's playing going to run at me? I think those are like the two main questions I'm asking. So, for example, if it's a more ranged matchup, for example, let's say just the Breakers versus Isle Vicket, or Breakers versus High Elves, in which I don't expect my opponent to immediately start rushing at me. If I'm the High Elves, which is thought to have the counterintuitively seems to have the range advantage in that matchup due to pieces and Cassia and all those other tools they have, you probably want to have your gates further and back. I know people like the B1 gate spot or the A2 gate spot are usually the two more range faction focused gates I know of, versus if I'm, for example, facing Jexic Wayfarers and I know that he's going to be running at me, I do want to have my gates in a position, usually again in the back two rows, in which I am able to keep my summoner safe, as well as make it hard for Jexic to clog all my gate spots. Usually you want to place your gate towards the more spread out side of your 10 health gate, whether it's the where there's 3 spaces instead of 2 spaces, I should say.
Yeah, I ultimately agree with that. One thing I do want to just briefly make a mention of, it took me a long time to realize that the board is actually not 6x6. Way too long. Such a weird thing is because it uses the card. It's not square spaces. They're like rectangular, like card-sized spaces. So it's 6 horizontally and 8 vertically, which actually does kind of mean like it can kind of give you like this weird illusion of distance sometimes, where like horizontal spaces are actually kind of closer to each other visually than vertical spaces are, if that makes sense. Or it might be the other way around. But anyway, ultimately, I think the points that you make, I generally agree with. If it's a matchup where it's like both people want to stay back, then yeah, back gates are really good in those kinds of cases. If both people want to run at each other, then it's going to be a bloodbath, and having like good mid-board gates is probably, if you're like fighting for mid-board, having like things that can back you up there makes sense. And then if there is a aggressor and a defender in the matchup, generally kind of positioning your gates around those makes sense. One thing I do want to shout out, it might be my spicy take for the episode, is I think forward gates are a bit overrated in my personal opinion, because one thing we've been talking about is that you'll want your opponent to clog your gate spots, because it both denies you options and it gives them cover. Forward gates, and when I say forward, I mean gates that are at the front of your line, equal to or like in front of your units. Kind of just let your opponent a lot of the times put a unit in front of them, and giving your opponent that cover behind your own card, so like it doesn't, you can still damage it, you can still attack it. It feels a little bit bad sometimes, unless you're getting into like end game to like have to kill your own gate to get to your opponent's stuff. It can be really, really rough. Even like if you're aggressing, to shout out the Mountain Vargoth versus Deepwood Grokes matchup again, one thing I found when I was practicing for that matchup was that if you give the Groaks a gate that they can take the front spot on, which they can spot steal with like Swift and things like that, then it can be really hard to get rid of it, especially with things like Mind Wardens, having Protect. And it actually, even though you were running at them as the Mountain Vargrith, you kind of still want your gates behind your line. So my take is that generally, not always, but having gates behind your units but still forward is usually better when you're aggressing than having them in front of your units while they're being forward. The only, I guess, like asterisk to that would be it's really good to like slam a gate in front of your opponent's 10 gate or other like prominent gate, because then you're not really giving them cover, right? I guess you're giving the gate cover, so you couldn't destroy that gate as easily if you wanted, but it also protects the gate. So if your opponent might want to kill that gate, so that way you don't have the ability to reinforce your push. And it's the thing I love to do in Shimmersea Fae is put a gate in front of your opponent's gate, because then if they want to go hit you, they have to go past your gate. If they want to clog the gate, then really all they're hitting is that gate, unless you have other units on the sides. For like aggression gates, that's my take.
I find Grognak likes to place gates on people's gates too. I feel like that's a classic move in Grognak versus Maldaria, is to just like shove a gate on front of her gate. So talking about gates that make sense for aggressive play, like I was saying, a common thing I do with the Wayfarers without thinking, and maybe I need to think about it more and try more different things, but is to just slam an A3 or F3 gate, which is either the left side or the right side, and the farthest forward that you can get on your half without moving Celeste up. But put it on the side that you think your opponent's summoner is going to move, or that you can even convince them to not go there, essentially. You know, like if you're up against like the Obsidian Dwarves or the Tundra Orcs, where it looks like they're going to go to your right side, put your gate on your right side so that you can jump on them if they try to get into the fray.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, I think something building on what Exile was saying, to be wary about if you're placing those forward gates, be very aware of the reach that your opponent has and how close they can get to being in front of that gate. Like if you're playing against Tundra Orcs, think about a Charger, or if you're playing against Cave Goblins, think about Climbers and what they could get through, or Clingers and other aspects, or like Sneak, because you really want to make sure that they can't get a unit on that gate right away. I played Massimo as Spectral Conclave against his Cave Goblins recently, and I placed a gate in a spot where I knew he could get there. And in my back of my mind, I was debating between placing it there and one space back. And I was like, well, he can get there, but the most dice he can roll on it is 5. There's no way he destroys the gate in one turn. Lo and behold, he destroyed the gate in one turn. I could not rebuttal how I wanted, because I was like, if he places it up there and gets to it and destroys it, he has to put Sneaks out there, and he has to expose Sneaks a little bit, so I'll at least get some damage on Sneaks. And nope, all 5 health was gone, and I was just sat there looking silly with one less gate against the Cave Goblins, which is never how you want to play against the Cave Goblins. One less gate, bad idea.
Terrifying.
It also brings up an interesting point too, I think, about your opponent's threat ranges when you place a gate, or if they've got the gate first. I think that's a big thing. Trying to make an aggressive push is like, if your opponent gets a gate out first, you don't want to place your first extra gate in a position where they can move from that gate to block your gate, right? So sometimes, rather than mirroring their gate side, you might put your gate on the other side so that you're still away from their forward gate.
That's a big thing that I think about a lot. So, like, if we're using like the normal D2 10 gate, right? I love an F3 gate because it's taking space on that side of the board that your opponent's 10 gate is farthest from. But there's a big difference between putting down that F3 gate when your opponent has, it would be your like F6, their A3 gate already down. Because on one, it's kind of like a who can get there first situation, right? If you put your F3 gate down there first before they have their thing, now if they put a gate, unless they also get a unit over there, you can go take the front summoning spot of that gate. Take cover on the edge of a board too. So like there's only one real flank from your left that they could really attack from unless they get a unit behind it. So it's like a very, very safe spot to tuck a unit and take control on that right side of the board. Your gate spot is open and can like summon and reinforce. Their gate spot's blocked. You have the option if you want, but you don't necessarily even always want to, chipping their gate and maybe killing it at some point. But if you inverse this and they get their gate down there first, then if you put yours down, the same thing can happen to you. So it is kind of like a who can get there first situation a lot of the time. That being said, factions that have the ability to spot steal, both playing them and playing against them, I think kind of change the math a bit. To use Eternal Council, because that's what I've been playing recently. As an example, Media kind of can do a maneuver, I would call it like a poisoned gate, where she can run up and put a gate in front of her, and even like a space in front of opponent's 10 gate, where if they wanted to, they could surround that thing on 3 sides. But if you have, like a Seek, Psychic Assault, maybe some extra card draw as well, like in hand, if they full clog it, you can just Psychic Assault melt all of the things around said gate.
Mhm.
And if they kill
Yeah.
it, you can do the same thing. That's not necessarily spot sealing, but it's still important. It's like, oh, I can ping things through this gate. So I can still affect things that are in front of this thing that would normally be really, really bad giving cover to your opponent. High Elves would also be is an excellent example of, unless you're using champions or your summoner, they can clear their gate spots incredibly easy, and also steal your front gate spots incredibly easily with Dictate and Oblige and things like that. You can go from your gate having a unit in front of it to having a high elf common there instead if they have 2 uses of Dictate. That's another thing to factor into all this like strategy is how much can your opponent spot steal? How much can you spot steal? Usually, like a lot of factions require like a summoner involvement to like do spot stealing, like martial forces and oblige and dictate and things like that, but not always. So knowing what you have and what your opponent has access to, I guess, is another big thing, which just goes back into matchups.
Yeah, 100%. Building off what you guys are talking about, and I completely agree, where sometimes forward gates are bad. And I think in general, when you're placing a gate, as you guys are pointing out, like the main thing which I'm thinking about all the time is, can my opponent next turn easily block in this gate spot, or, start attacking from 2 or more sides on this gate spot, this gate which I'm placing? And a lot of times it's not worth it. That said, as you showed during our game, and you alluded to this also earlier, Exile, when we were playing my Owl Wicked versus your Filth, you did a great job at the end of the game sort of boxing me in by placing gates around me, making it so that I basically had very little space to maneuver with the Owl Wicked. And then not only that, but a lot of times if you do have these very aggressive gates in your opponent's face, they have to choose. One of the beautiful things about Summoner Wars, most factions only have 3 attacks. So you really have to choose what you're attacking. And especially if someone's in your face, a lot of times this happens with cave goblins, where you have to choose, like, what's the most important thing for me to clear on the board. And a lot of times you give your opponent a very hard time as cave goblins, where they have to choose whether they clear your units on their side of the board or their gates on your side of the board. Yeah, sometimes you can be using it as a distraction. That said, I don't normally recommend, and I think this is probably what you're alluding to also, Exile, that your first gate, which you have, is in a easy position for your opponent to kill. Otherwise, they're able to kill it, like Aaron pointed out, in a turn. Then all of a sudden, it kind of feels like you're caught with your pants down, where all your units are so far pushed up without any backup that your opponent can turn the tides on the board.
So unfortunately, this episode went a little bit long, so the second part will be in 2 weeks. This has been another episode of Discard for Magic, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.